This is an extremely powerful adjustment when it comes to color, but it is probably just as misunderstood as curves, maybe even more so. The way the properties are set up and laid out certainly don't make it instantly clear on how it is to be used. On the face of it, it doesn't seem like any of these controls are very usable. We have Hue, which of course just starts changing all of the colors in a very weird and impractical way. Then we have the Saturation slider, and as we just saw a moment ago, it adjusts the saturation of all colors within our image, and quite dramatically. If we take it all the way to the left, we will end up with no color, and if we take it all the way to the right, it starts to posterize everything. Now when used with caution, this slider can be of some use, but it's very touchy and it can really degrade your image if you aren't careful. Moving on, we have the Lightness slider, which seems to do way more harm than good, simply adding white or black to the overall image. Yep, worthless. At last, we have this little Colorize button. This feature eliminates the color within the image and then, by utilizing the Hue slider, allows you to add a color cast. Now this can actually be fun for pop art images, or if you just want a slight blue or purple tone to your image. You can increase or decrease the saturation based on what look you're after, and it's also a great way to achieve a sepia tone by setting the hue to an orange or yellow value and then dropping the saturation. So it is of some use to us, but certainly not something we gravitate towards on a regular basis. Now, that being the extent of the knowledge that most of us have about this adjustment, it really doesn't seem very powerful at all. But this is because it isn't meant to be used on our image as a whole. The hue part of this adjustment is probably the most important thing about it. It is to be used within one hue at a time. So let's talk about changing the colors within our image, and you will quickly see this adjustment come to life. Take notice of these two sort of rainbow-like color strips here at the bottom. They don't seem to serve any purpose, but if you go up here to where it says Master and click, you will get a list of the individual colors that make up the image. Now these 6 colors are important, and you will see them time and time again when working in adjustment layers, as they are the colors that make up every image in Photoshop. Red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. Okay, let's choose a color. It doesn't matter which one. And now you will see all of these new controls pop up around our color strips, as well as this slider in between the 2 strips. If we slide it back and forth, it doesn't seem to be doing anything, but that's because all we've done is chosen a color range. The top strip shows the color range that you have chosen, in this case green. Now, for temporary visibility purposes, let's take the saturation all the way up just so we can see what we're doing. Now we can see that in fact we have chosen a color range of green, and that is certainly what's being affected when we make changes. And when we move our color range slider, you can see that as we approach a new color on our top color strip, the affected area of our image changes to reflect that color range. Okay, if we stop at a certain color range and release our mouse, regardless of what color we chose from the drop-down menu, it will automatically change to whatever color we land on. See that? Now I'm going to step back a couple of times because I actually do want to alter the color of this fence to something that looks a little more like wood. The moss that covers it makes it blend right in with the grass and gives this harsh green tint to everything in the background. But before we do that, we need to talk about this slider first. It's pretty important and has a lot of moving parts and pieces. The darker gray center indicates the main color in your chosen range, in this case green. If you click and drag this part of the slider, the entire thing will move and choose a different color range. The lighter gray part on either side of that indicates the color fall off, which is the colors that surround the green and will apply your changes in sort of a feathering effect as the colors fade into different colors within your image. In other words, in addition to changing the areas that are pure green, this part of the slider takes into account other colors that are similar to green, or that green might fade into, and affects them to a lesser degree. This just keeps your changes balanced and looking more natural. Does that make sense? Now, this slider also has these markers that separate everything out, allowing you to fine-tune your color range depending on what your image needs. For instance, I want to change the color of the fence, but I don't want the sky that's visible through the gaps in the fence to be affected. So I'll check my color range, and sure enough, the fall-off values include cyan. So to fix that, I can move the entire slider over a little closer to the yellow greens. Then I can grab the fall off section and bring it out on the left side a little to include more yellow within my actual range of green, and then bring it in on the right side a little to factor out more cyan. And even further if needed by grabbing the actual marker at the edge of the fall off and pulling that in a little tighter to completely eliminate the cyan. In fact, you can move any of the individual markers as needed. As you can see, you can get very precise in choosing your range. Just try not to set your fall off too low or it could produce banding and grain in your image. Okay, I have now chosen a range of primarily the yellow greens and completely factored out all of the blue greens. So now that we have our range selected and can see exactly which areas of our image are going to be affected, let's go ahead and move our saturation slider back to 0. Now, here is how this adjustment is really supposed to be used. We are going to begin dragging our hue slider to begin changing the color of our fence. Now, as I move this slider to the left, I want to draw your attention to everything that is happening all at the same time. The first thing you'll notice is that the fence begins to change color, looking more and more like a wood color the more I move it to the left. If I turn the visibility off and on here, you can really see the difference. But I also want you to notice our bottom color strip. Remember, the top color strip is the existing color range within our image. The bottom strip is what we are changing our color range to. So when we move the hue slider back and forth, the bottom strip changes to reflect what color we are replacing our original color range with. So the top is what we started with, the bottom is what we will end up with. Make sense? Okay, so I'm happy with this color of the fence, but let's fine-tune it a bit more. Let's decrease the saturation, and as you can see, when we move this slider now within a specific color range, it has a super subtle and natural effect on our image. Same with our lightness slider. It works beautifully within a specific color range as opposed to the entire image or the master setting. So I'm going to bump the lightness up quite a bit just to help the fence sort of disappear more into the background and pull the focus to her a little better. See how natural the effect is now? Who knew all we had to do was choose a color? Now, obviously, I don't want my grass to be the same color as the fence, so this is where our layer mask will earn its keep. We can simply choose our brush tool, set our foreground color to black, click on our layer mask, and then paint over the grass with black to hide the color change from that part of the image. There we go. Now, let's look at the before and the after. Perfect. Okay, the last thing I will mention here is that although we are able to click on the thumbnail and regain access to the properties of our adjustment, for whatever reason, Photoshop doesn't remember which color range we changed. And when we come back, it has switched back to master. So try to get in the habit of changing the name of the layer to the color range and what area of the image you changed the color of. For instance, I'll name this layer Fence Greens. This may not seem so urgent right now, but if you have an image with 10 different hue saturation layers changing 10 different areas of your image, you will want to be able to quickly find your adjustments. The long way of figuring out what color range we changed is by clicking through the colors on each layer. So red, all is set to 0, yellow, all set to 0, green. Okay, there's our change. Now that would take quite a while if you had 10 of those to go through. Now, just for demonstration's sake, let's play with a few more colors here and really make things pop. Let's start with her clothes. Let's add another Hue Saturation Adjustment Layer, and this time we'll choose magenta. Let's crank our saturation all the way up and define our color range. Take out the blues, bring this in a little. There we go. Now, let's take our saturation back down to a more realistic value, say around 50. Then, let's bring our lightness up to about 20, just to bring back some dimension. And we'll actually leave the hue alone because we don't want to change the color of her skirt. It's quite nice as it is. Now, we'll name this layer Clothes Magentas. Okay, now let's make this grass pop a little more. Let's add another Hue Saturation Adjustment Layer, choose our greens again, and crank up the saturation. Now, we can still see a bit of green left behind in our fence, so we'll just mask that part out in a minute. let's make sure our color range is where we want it. Okay, set our saturation. Around 40 looks pretty good. And let's drop our lightness down, maybe to about -30, just to give this grass some weight and depth. There we go. Now we'll mask out the area of the fence, and then change the name of our layer to Grass Greens. And then last, let's focus on our sky. Choose our blues and turn up the saturation. And I'm actually going to leave this range as is. I know it looks like it will affect her skirt, but as you can see, without that saturation cranked up, you really can't see that blue. So I'm just going to leave it. I'll bring up my saturation to around 40 and my lightness to around 50. And the real change actually takes place in the sky. If you could really see that blue in her skirt, you could of course just mask it out. Okay, now let's take a closer look at the before and then the after. You can see that the colors are much better assigned within the image and are now able to stand out from one another, really giving things more depth and dimension, and in a very natural way that doesn't feel photoshopped. Okay, now the next few adjustments aren't quite this complex, but can be just as powerful. So let's move on, shall we?